Thomas didn't fall while walking. He fell while turning, between one intention and the next. It wasn't the slip that surprised him. It was how the ground came early, without warning, in a house he'd known for 40 years. Sometimes falls don't come from failure. They come from the spaces we stop noticing. Walking changes after 60, not all at once, but in the way the foot forgets to roll, the gaze begins to drop, the arms go still, and the body grows uncertain in silence. This isn't about performance. It's not about walking more. It's about walking with presence, with memory, with trust slowly rebuilt between breath and step. One, the forward gaze. Thomas didn't notice when his eyes began looking down instead of forward. It wasn't sudden. It happened over months, maybe years. One sidewalk crack at a time, one missed step, one warning from a well-meaning nurse. Watch your footing. So he watched every line on the tile, every uneven patch of ground, every place the floor might shift, and slowly, his posture folded, not from pain, from vigilance. His world became 10 inches wide, from his toes to the floor just ahead. Until one morning, he stood in the hallway, paused, and asked himself, "What am I walking toward?" Not in life, just in that moment. He looked up, not far, just ahead. The door frame, the window, the light landing on the chair, and something inside him rose to meet that gaze. The spine, long asleep in its own slope, began to uncurl. It didn't fix his balance, but it changed his direction. He wasn't walking to avoid a fall. He was walking to arrive. Now, each time he walks, he lifts his eyes just a little earlier. Not to challenge fear, but to remember there's more to walk toward than just what might trip him. And when he forgets, he forgives himself. Pauses. Lifts his gaze again. Because after 60, forward isn't a direction, it's a decision. And sometimes it begins with where we choose to look. 2. The quiet roll. Thomas used to walk without thinking. Foot forward, ground below, done. But somewhere between his 40s and now, his feet stopped feeling like instruments and started feeling like tools. Something he used, not something he listened to. Until one afternoon, alone, he stepped out of his shoes. Not for comfort, for curiosity. He placed both feet on the living room rug and waited. It had been years since his soles had touched anything without rubber in between. At first there was silence, then texture, then something almost like memory. He took one step, heel, pause, ball, toe, not forced, not rehearsed, just ancient, something the body once knew without asking. He walked across the rug, back and forth. Each step a whisper, each landing a letter the ground wrote back to him. He realized he'd been placing his feet like stamps, heavy, flat, impatient. But the floor was not an enemy. It was an old friend he'd stopped greeting properly. So he kept walking. 10 minutes, maybe 15. And when he sat again, he didn't feel strong. He felt real. He hadn't fixed his balance, but he had returned to the dialogue beneath him. And sometimes he'd do it again, just a few barefoot steps before the kettle boiled, not to practice, to apologize, and to remind the body, I still want to feel you here. 3. The gentle core. Thomas used to think stability came from his legs, strong thighs, solid shoes, knees that didn't hesitate, but strength had faded without warning. And now, when he walked, he often felt like a coat hung on too thin a hanger. One day, during a home visit, the therapist placed a hand gently on his belly and said, "Start here." He laughed. This part just gets in the way." She smiled. "No, this part holds you up." She showed him how to breathe into the space behind the navel, how to lift, not clench, how to imagine zipping up from the base of the spine to the top of the chest before taking a step. It felt theatrical at first, unnatural, but something inside him stirred, a centering, a subtle alertness. He practiced in the hallway, just a few steps at a time. Inhale, zip, exhale, step. And in those moments, he noticed his knees stop shouting, his feet stop bracing, because the message had finally been received from the middle. He no longer saw his core as something to be tightened or trained. He saw it as a hand offered to the rest of his body. I've got you. Now, before each walk, he pauses, draws breath, lifts softly, and lets his next step begin from the inside. Not because he wants to be taller, but because he wants to feel like he's still standing in himself. 4. The swing. We lost Thomas never noticed when his arms stopped swinging. It wasn't a decision, just a quiet stilling. At first he thought it was age, a kind of economy. Let the legs do the work, save the rest. But something began to feel off balance, not in the feet, in the rhythm. He walked, but it felt like half a movement, like a song missing its drums. Then one afternoon, he passed by a mirror, caught himself shuffling, hands stiff by his sides, like luggage he no longer carried. He paused, took a breath, tried again. This time, he let his arms move, not big, not fast, just release, forward, back, opposite the foot, like he used to without knowing. It felt awkward at first, like pretending. But after a few steps, his hips softened. His stride found space. His shoulders dropped from their quiet guard. He remembered a phrase from years ago. Your arms are anchors. And now they became that again. Not to pull him down, but to keep him steady in motion. Now he lets them swing every morning, not for fitness, not for show, but for balance in the deepest sense. Because the body doesn't forget movement, it waits. And when you return to it, even with uncertainty, it forgives you. One arm at a time. 5. The wider step. Thomas had always walked like he was trying to disappear, feet close, toes inward. Each step cautious, as if the floor might scold him for taking up too much space. It wasn't conscious, it was habit. A choreography inherited from crowded sidewalks, tight hallways, years of learning to be efficient. But now, efficiency didn't feel steady. It felt fragile. One day, his therapist said gently, wider, and he resisted. Wider felt awkward, exposed, less elegant. But she said it again, think train tracks. 2 strong lines, parallel, carrying weight without wobble. So he tried, just a little. He set his feet shoulder-width apart and took one step, then another. The ground didn't shift, his knees didn't protest. Something unexpected happened. His body sighed, as if it had been waiting for permission to claim more room. He walked the hallway again, this time not like a tightrope walker holding tension, but like someone who belonged to the floor beneath him. He realized that sometimes we walk narrowly, not because it's right, but because we've gotten used to shrinking. Now, when he walks, he lets his legs speak clearly. No hiding, no squeezing the path into something smaller. It's not about grace anymore. It's about grounding, and each wider step feels like a quiet reclaiming of balance, of dignity, of space he forgot was always his. 6. The transitions. Thomas didn't fall while walking straight. He fell in the in-between, the corner, the shift from carpet to tile. The place where hallway became kitchen, soft became slick. Familiar became uncertain. It wasn't that he didn't see it, he just didn't pause. His body moved out of habit, one step flowing into the next, like the world would always match his rhythm. Until one day, it didn't. He caught himself, barely, hands bracing the counter, heart louder than the impact. It wasn't a fall, but it was a message. The next morning, he stood at the same threshold. This time, he waited. 3 seconds, one breath, a glance at where his foot would land, and then he stepped, not as a reaction, as a choice. It felt strange at first, interrupting his own flow, but it also felt respectful, as if he was asking his body, Are you ready for this shift? And the body, so used to being rushed, finally had time to answer. He began doing it everywhere, before turning, before climbing stairs, before standing from a chair. Not from fear, from reverence, from understanding that transitions are not small. They are the spaces where awareness either enters or vanishes. The fall had not come from weakness. It had come from assumption. Now, his movement is slower, but more whole. He doesn't drift between moments, he steps into them. And that pause, those 3 seconds of breath, have become his way of saying, I am still with you. 7. The daily whisper. Thomas didn't follow a checklist, not every day. He couldn't remember all 7 steps, and he didn't try to. Some mornings, his knees spoke before his mind woke up. Other days, his shoes stayed untouched while he sipped coffee by the window. But even in those quiet hours, something in him moved. Not far, not fast, just enough to say, I'm still here. He learned to measure success not in the length of his walk, but in the softness of his steps, in the way his shoulders stayed low, in the way his breath met the floor before his feet did. There were days he forgot, moved too quickly, tripped over his own hurry. But he didn't scold himself anymore. He paused, put a hand on the wall, and began again. Not from the beginning, just from where he was. He started keeping a small notebook on the kitchen counter, not for tracking progress, for listening. Each page held a question. What did your walk say today? Some days, nothing. Some days, everything. And on days when words didn't come, he let silence answer for him. One step, then another. That was the rhythm he trusted most. Because the body doesn't need perfection. It needs presence. And even when he did none of the steps, no posture, no pause, no wide base or swing, he still walked with something different. Awareness, companion-like, steady. He had made walking a form of remembering, a ritual of being with himself, not pushing against time. And that was more than enough. Thomas didn't grieve the fall itself. He grieved the space that had quietly grown between how he used to move and how he moved now. He used to walk without announcing it. The body just responded. Feet followed thought. Steps followed desire. But now each movement required conversation, negotiation. Can you do this? Are you steady? Will this be safe? The floor hadn't changed. The hallways hadn't shifted. But he had. And he hadn't been invited to notice. That's where the grief settled. Not in the knees or the bruises, but in the quiet realization that walking was no longer automatic. It was conscious, cautious, curated, like playing an old song but forgetting some of the chords. He remembered the version of himself who danced without checking the floor, who ran for the bus, who carried groceries without second-guessing his balance. That version hadn't died. He'd just been placed on pause. And now, in the slow rhythm of recovery, Thomas felt that distance stretch between them. But this grief wasn't cruel. It wasn't asking for pity. It was a call, a beckoning, a whisper saying, "You're still here, but you've been walking ahead of your own body." So he stopped trying to catch up to who he used to be and began walking back, step by step, toward a version of himself that still existed, but waited to be met with care, because grief, when heard, becomes a map. And Thomas was finally following it home. He once believed getting better meant getting stronger, firmer muscles, faster strides, the kind of movement you could measure. But healing didn't arrive with metrics. It arrived in silence, in softness. It arrived the first time he stopped halfway through the hallway. Not because he was tired, but because he realized he hadn't been present for a single step before it. He stood still, hand grazing the wall, and asked, not aloud, but inward, "Am I here yet?" And something inside him answered, not with certainty, but with willingness. That's when he began again, not faster, not stronger, just slower. He began to notice the breath before the movement, the shift of weight before the leg followed, the way his toes whispered before meeting the floor. It wasn't about walking well. It was about walking true, in tempo with the part of himself that had been waiting for permission to rejoin. He thought stability lived in technique. Turns out, it lived in tenderness, in how gently he met the next step, in how clearly he allowed his own timing. Now when he walks, he doesn't perform, he listens. Each movement a small reunion with the version of himself that didn't need to hurry, and when others call it slow, he calls it sacred. Because healing, for him, was never about speed. It was about remembering how to walk as if each step mattered, and it does. You don't have to walk fast, or far, or with the grace you once had. You only have to walk as if you still belong in the life you're in. If your feet have become quiet, listen closer. If the floor feels unfamiliar, meet it slower. If your body hesitates at the edge of a room, let that hesitation be holy, not shameful. Not everything has to return to how it was. Some things ask only that you return to them with care. The hallway still knows you. The chair you reach for still remembers your weight, and your steps, even the uneven ones, still carry meaning. You don't need a plan. You don't need 7 secrets. You only need to notice when your body speaks and stay long enough to answer. Let walking become a ritual of reunion, not with youth, not with confidence, but with presence, with breath, with the smallest part of you that still wants to feel alive on this earth. And if tomorrow your balance wavers or your stride feels unsure, pause. Hold the wall, hold your chest. Hold the truth that this too is a form of movement. We'll be here, not ahead of you, not behind, just beside. Until next time, take one quieter step and take care of your story.